Good morning.
Good afternoon.
And good evening to everyone. As we near the end of day one of our International Climate Symposium, I am astounded by the depth and breadth of the experts who are here on our campus discussing that all-important topic, that is climate change.
We hope that this three-day conference will provide a basis for deeper reflections on climate issues among participants, especially students, the scientists,
politicians, governments,
members of the local and global community,
cities, nations,
people around the world.
There is a groundswell of interest right now to do something about the climate problem. But many people feel overwhelmed by the magnitude of the challenge.
Climate change is already affecting every inhabited region across the globe, with human influence contributing to many observed changes in weather and climate extremes.
Risks from climate change will be very different from the risks we have experienced so far. It will be a compounding risk, it will be a cascading risk affecting ecosystems, people, all the sectors, and also every region.
The Working Group 2 report also indicates that climate change is an enormous challenge for vulnerable communities around the world. And very often when I speak to audiences and I talk about vulnerable communities, I get the sense that some people think that vulnerable communities are kind of a handful of people living in some remote area somewhere, whereas our report really busts open that myth. It indicates that virtually half of the world's population, somewhere between 3.3 and 3.6 billion people, live in hotspots of high vulnerability to climate change around the world. And really unsurprisingly, these hotspots are where? Africa, South Asia, South and Central America, the small islands, the Arctic. And again, the report urges us, don't think about this problem as a simple one. Don't think that these communities only have to deal with climate change. Again, these communities also have to deal with a whole series of overlapping challenges. In many cases, lack of access to basic services, so things like health services, water and sanitation. Many people living in these communities have climate-sensitive livelihoods, so they're smallholder farmers or small-scale fishers. They often have to deal with very high levels of poverty, weak leadership, lack of funding, lack of accountability and trust in governments in the areas in which they live.
So I experienced firsthand the kind of complications that you run into trying to do this sort of work in a local government. It could be everything from not knowing where to start, from a lack of manpower or expertise, lack of budget, and even if none of those things are a problem, trying to convince politicians that they need to start redirecting resources towards addressing a future problem as opposed to dealing with the sort of business as usual day-to-day operations of their city is definitely complicated.
There are, however, things we can do now, That is, on the demand side, we can reduce the greenhouse gas emissions by 40 to 70% by 2030, within the next 30 years, through changes in infrastructure use, end-use technology adoption, and behavioral, social, cultural change. All these things that we can and we should do are contingent upon, may I say, a political will, public support, and personal and individual motivation.
Responding to climate change is an enormous scientific, technological, economic, civic, and humanitarian enterprise. All of us have responsibilities for acting on climate change. All of us have roles to play as citizens, community members, educators, scientists, innovators, urban planners, storytellers, business leaders, and other callings. And all of us can bring needed knowledge, expertise, and capabilities to the task of mobilizing effective action on climate change.
Political commitment at all spheres is absolutely vital. This has to be a whole of society response. No one can sit this one out. We also heard in the last panel and during the course of the discussions today the importance of a more systemic approach to the climate change challenge. This is not a linear A to B journey that we're going to take as a society. We need to think more broadly. And Steve introduced this idea of thinking about actions that not only contribute to an ambitious climate response, but that enable us to make progress on the Sustainable Development Agenda, which is probably the biggest societal project we have to hand. But how do we get there? As I say, this has to be a whole of society response, which means it's got to be picked up by all spheres of government, all levels of civil society. Everyone needs to be sitting around the table to be engaging.
Continuing to educate the public, educate the stakeholder community, so that they're able to have an informed conversation about the paths forward.
Because I think at the end of the day, what it does is basically two things. It broadens the participation of the scientists at the table, but it also broadens the perspective of the questions being asked. And you have to have both. You can't do one without the other. You can't just say we're going to have scientists who look like society, but we're still asking the same old questions. We have to ask different questions.
This is what science to policy to action looks like. It is understanding the big picture while seeing that the action on the front lines is what makes the difference. It's embracing diversity and keeping the needs of the most vulnerable and the generations to come front and center as we solve this problem.
When it comes to climate solutions, my education has taught me to be wary of quick fixes and instead recognize that equitable and lasting change require listening, collaboration, and a deep love for our planet and its people.
There is no single pathway, let's say, to be compliant with the Paris Agreement. There are various possibilities, and basically the IPCC cannot be prescriptive, but it has to indicate that there are many ways to reach our objective, but we have to start now. So we cannot delay action. We have to do something very soon, 2025, if not even before that, in order to be able to keep temperature below 2 degrees and eventually even below 1.5 degrees. So many ways to get there, but we have to do something.
There's a lot of different pathways for doing it. That to me is something that's useful to know. So there's not just one, and if we get it wrong, we're not going to be able to do it. There's a lot of different possibilities, so that's good to be able to recognize those different possibilities and what they mean. The other is that there's a lot of uncertainty.
But one of the themes here I just have to say is not only are there no silver bullets, all the bullets have problems. There's just nothing that's clean or completely, without conflict, and that's just a reality that we're going to have to face. There are going to be some serious trade-offs as we do go through this energy transition.
And in fact, let's say, when you look at some of these scenarios, in some of them, developing countries reach net zero before developed countries, which from a kind of fairness principle is not reasonable, but from a global point of view is a risk of solution, meaning that we have to have, let's say, a proper mechanism in place, finance, let's say, transfer of technology, in order to allow developing countries to do what's expected from them, which is not exactly their first choice. And that's why we have to really be careful here, because we're talking about different realities, but one single global problem. So this is the complexity of the issue we're discussing here.
The other part of it is highlighting the opportunities, right? When we move into a new economy, a new low-carbon economy, right, there's going to be lots of opportunities there as well. And helping those that view themselves as losers in the current economy that would have to change might be useful to also highlight that they could become the winners in the future in terms of taking advantage of those future opportunities.
Adaptation is a response to climate change in which each actor has a strong self-interest in taking some action to protect their property values, to protect what's important to them. Mitigation is an action that a lot of the benefit from it is accruing to others. And so it requires a sort of collective agreement to how are we going to come together to, take an action that may be in our self-interest, but only if lots of others join in it with us. That's been a harder sell. That's been a difficult challenge.
That adaptation then has to be as important as mitigation to solve the climate crisis. This is why IPCC has an entire working group devoted to adaptation, but adaptation has played a second fiddle to mitigation for decades now. If you look at climate finance, right, 10% of climate finance is on adaptation. That's a problem that we absolutely have to solve. So we can talk about system transformations, but we're going to have to actually talk about and find the levers of mechanisms in civil government, in federal government and policies with the private sector to increase adaptation spending by 10 to 100 times to deal with both the current challenges we're already facing in cities, but the ones that are coming in the next 10 to 20 years, let alone further out into the next 80 years, as you mentioned. Last night, Neil suggested that maybe adaptation was easier to get done than mitigation. But you pointed out last night, and I think this is clear from our report, we're so far away from where we need to be in terms of actually bringing adaptation to the fore to deal with the kinds of challenges that cities are already facing and the ones that we think they're going to continue to face. And it comes back to that first point I made, that concentration of people and infrastructure and economies in small places, relatively small land area wise, means that's where we're seeing the largest impact of these climate-driven extreme events. And those are the places that really emphasize why cities have to be a fundamental part of the solution.
And we need states like Pennsylvania, which is doing its part, all states, all cities to get more ambitious on climate action. There's a lot of great stuff going on there. We need the best technologies that we can get a hold of. We need to bring the cost down of technologies. And we need technologies which are affordable, scalable, and have and minimize the impacts.
The scientific evidence is clear that we can have a very high standard of living and scale back our per capita energy use. And I think that it's also time that we have a discussion about sufficiency. What do we need versus what do we want? I have a 15-year-old son. I always like to mention him. I have a 15-year-old son, and, there's no limit to what he wants. There's no limit to what we want as humans, but there are limits to what we need. And I think that's just another way for us to think about that.
That aspect of the symposium, the grounding of science and policy in this place, has been one of the most profoundly rewarding things about this symposium. And these conversations have reinforced for me the idea that cities, communities, and universities provide just the right level of engagement to magnify individual ambition and motivate action.
What are we willing to do about that? This is knowledge that you need to take with you and think about that, reflect on that. What will you do with that knowledge? Do we have that kind of empathy for people who are on another continent, living very different lives than those of us in this room? But this is something we need to really take seriously. So this is the work of a lifetime, of many lifetimes. It's urgent, but it's not something that ends. This is something we really need to take on in a very forceful way. It's work that we need to do locally, nationally, globally. It's work that requires love. It requires empathy. It requires storytelling. So choose to engage, choose to learn more, choose to participate, be active. And that would be my closing comment to you, other than thank you very much for taking the time that you spent with us in the room, the virtual audience, our panelist speakers, everyone who participated in this symposium. I am just deeply, deeply grateful for the time that you've given to this.